Hello, everyone. I'm very pleased to extend a warm welcome to the webinar, Rethinking uh, on the Capacity Building for Disaster Risk Management for Cultural Heritage in the light of COVID-19, which is organized by Ritsumeikan University, Institute of Disaster Mitigation for Urban Cultural Heritage, and Eeprom. We had our first webinar last week, and which was focused on rethinking disaster mitigation and preparedness. And this time, we are having our webinar on rethinking disaster response and recovery. Just a little background of Eeprom, the International Center for the Study of Preservation and Restoration of Cultural Property, is an intergovernmental organization working in the service of 137 member states for promoting conservation of all forms of cultural heritage in every region in the world. So, Ritsumeikan University was accredited as a UNESCO Chair Program on Cultural Heritage and Risk Management in 2006, and since then, we have been organizing an international training course on disaster risk mitigation for cultural heritage, besides organizing many research activities in advance. And also, we have been disseminating knowledge on reducing disaster risks as well as preparing, responding, and recovering from them following disasters. Caused by both natural and human induced hazards such as earthquakes, floods, fires, typhoons, and cyclones. So I'll just turn on my screen now. Just a second. So as I mentioned, this webinar today is really about disaster response and recovery. And We all know what has been the impact of COVID-19 on cultural heritage. We have seen what was the status before the COVID pandemic started and how all our cultural heritage sites have been abandoned, and there was a lockdown, many institutions got closed, and the impact has been really phenomenal as we have been watching. Besides that, there has also been a lot of impact on intangible cultural heritage, as a lot of cultural practices, rituals have also they were not being able to be done. So this pandemic has had influence on cultural heritage on different levels. Also, many people's livelihoods, which were dependent on cultural heritage, have been also very badly affected. But on the other hand, you see how the livelihoods are affected, and people are not even able to, earn their living. And what we have also realized is heritage is not only vulnerable, but it is also the source of resilience. And this has been very clear during this pandemic, that how cultural heritage has actually provided people a kind of support mechanism in this hour of crisis. Um, Now, let's see disaster risk management, which we all understand basically from the three stages as to what we do before, during, and risk assessment as an important step that we follow at every stage. Let's look at it from the lens of COVID-19. What has COVID-19 taught us in terms of the lessons that we can put back into our understanding on disaster risk management for all the stages? And the last webinar, we covered the stages before a disaster strikes in terms of what should we do for mitigation and preparedness. And this time we are going to look at response and recovery. That's what we do during a disaster situation and afterwards. Now, the question is, how should we continue capacity building on disaster risk management of cultural heritage by tailoring existing knowledge and skills, identifying and filling gaps, target audience, and pedagogy based on the lessons learned from this pandemic? So we are hoping that these webinars will help us to understand what are those topics, what are those skills that we need to bring in for in our future courses. Now, the question is for us is, how do we turn this new normal into new opportunity? And in that lens, with that perspective, we are going to look at the whole thematic theme of rethinking disaster response and recovery. Now, I will briefly summarize the key considerations for COVID-19 in terms of response. So, one of the important things we have learned is that how we have to work within the new hygiene requirements to prevent contagion. So how can we adapt our response mechanism with this kind of new limitation? How do we respond to both tangible and intangible heritage? Uh, what are the special considerations for lockdown and post lockdown phase in terms of managing our heritage sites and institutions? How do we ensure hygiene for our staff and visitors, continuity of business and livelihoods, and these are the things that we have to really think from the response perspective. Now, when we move from response to post-COVID recovery, we have to now think how can we build back better, how can we build resilience so that we are better prepared for such situations in the future. And in that context, we have to think about how to bring in public health as one of the goals of heritage management practice. How do we integrate energy efficiency in heritage management? Because we all know that climate change has been one of the factors which has affected this pandemic, and so we have to see how we can address climate change issues as well. How do we reconfigure visitor management in our heritage sites and institutions? Um, how do we use digital technology for heritage conservation and management? And then we also need to now think about low cost and innovative solutions for conservation and management, since we have limited resources and culture may not be the main priority at this moment for all good reasons, and we have to manage with the limited resources. So all these questions, all these points we will raise in this webinar through our panelists, and I'll pass the floor to Dr. Dovon Kim, who is Associate Professor at the Institute of Disaster Mitigation at Tsumekin University. So over to you, Dovon.
Thank you, Rohit. Let me start my introductory presentation with screen sharing. In response to the recommendation of the WCDR, United Nations World Conference on Disaster Reduction in 2005, Institute of Disaster Mitigation for Urban Cultural Heritage Ritsumeikan University, RDMUCH, has been acting as a focal point for organizing international research, training, and networking in the field of disaster risk management related to cultural heritage. As a result, Ritsumeikan University, in collaboration with Eeprom, established the International Training Course on Disaster Risk Management of Cultural Heritage in 2006, and has been organizing this annual course nicknamed as ITC every year as part of the UNESCO Chair Program. ITC provides the opportunity to every participant to plan the integration process of disaster risk management for cultural heritage. During ITC, participants could intensify an understanding of both various aspects of disaster risk management of cultural heritage in Japan and challenges, opportunities, and lessons from international research and practice in this field that are performed by specialized professionals and researchers from around the world. The participants who are drawn from cultural heritage and disaster risk management fields works in multidisciplinary teams to learn the principles and practical know-how by interactive lectures, site visits, exercises, workshops, and plentiful discussions. As a result of the efforts for developing and providing the integration and training course, the number of the applicants is increasing annually. And ITC could have trained 152 participants in total from 62 countries. ITC has focused on various topics that reflect international needs and interests in this vast field. During the last 3 years, we have focused on integrated protection of immovable and movable cultural heritage from disasters. For this, we have specially strengthened the part of the emergency response and first aid, and designed the process of response to recovery from the lessons of post-disasters in heritage sites and cities. Very strong cooperation with Eeprom, ITC is successfully providing the active learning resources, which are field survey and lectures in museums in Kyoto and field exercise for simulating first aid and rescue activities to move over heritage. For proper and effective understanding of long-term recovery process, we provide several site visits for participants to see and feel the real challenges on post-disaster heritage site. Finally, the participants could design the recovery process with considering different standpoints of various stakeholders and important role of cultural heritage. Today, we will discuss the capacity building on disaster risk management culture heritage based on the learnings from these post-COVID times, especially focused to disaster response and recovery. We are indeed privileged to be joined by a multidisciplinary group of panelists who are the key resource persons of ITC. And I'm delighted to introduce them to you. So may I request all the panelists to kindly turn on your cameras for our audiences to see you. Thank you. So please welcome Ms. Aparna Tandon from Eeprom, Dr. Wesley Chick from Rethinking University, Ms. Elke Selter from University of London, and Dr. Min Ji Ang from Georgetown World Heritage Incorporated, Malaysia. Thank you. So before I proceed further, may I apprise you of some procedures for housekeeping during this webinar. You can only send your queries and comments via Q&A icon that you could see at the bottom of the Zoom window. We'll check up some questions after the presentations by our panelists. In case we are unable to answer all the questions due to shortage of time, please do send us an email, then we'll surely get back to you. So let me have this privilege in firstly inviting Ms. Aparna Tandon from Eeprom. Ms. Aparna Tandon is a senior program leader of First Aid Resilience for Cultural Heritage, Sustaining Digital Heritage Program Unit at Eeprom. She specializes in crisis response and disaster risk reduction for cultural heritage. She has 25 years of post-qualification work experiences in cultural heritage conservation and has conducted professional training for the conservation of cultural heritage in Asia, the Middle East, Europe, Africa, and South America. She will give us the viewpoint for multi-hazard emergency responses and risk mitigation. Over to you, Aparna.
Thank you, Dovan. Hello, everyone. And it's a privilege here to join all of you. I would like to thank Rethinking University for inviting me on behalf of Eeprom. And to begin my presentation, I will start sharing my screen. And in order to ensure that the signal quality remains, I will switch off my video feed and share my screen starting now. I hope can see my screen. So I would like to begin with presenting you a scenario. Imagine that your city is hit by an earthquake while there are strict social restrictions, I just want to go back. There are strict social distancing restrictions are in place due to the ongoing pandemic. Furthermore, imagine that the museum that you're working for has suffered damage. Its historic building is also damaged. The objects inside are damaged, and you cannot get onto the site. Only a few emergency responders are allowed onto the site, but they are stretched thin, and your museum is not a priority. They have to respond first to a medical emergency. They have to evacuate people. They have to secure lives. They have to put up shelters, provide humanitarian aid. And this actually happened in Croatia on March 23. and several buildings as well as museums were affected by this emergency. Now, in this scenario, in order to respond, the person in charge of emergency response of the museum would have to coordinate with multiple agencies. They will have to get permissions to get some staff with the PPE or some other outside architects who know how to assess buildings, or engineers, to get them on board, get a damage and risk assessment done, think about how to stabilize the structures so that people can get in. Also think of ways in which objects, because museum collections are normally large, very large, and there are like several galleries there. So how to ensure that objects in situ are protected, and then the ones that have been damaged, they have to be salvaged, evacuated and relocated. You would have to think about restoration and retrofitting of the building when after doing an emergency stabilization. At the same time, the museum has to think about its business continuity, maintaining an online presence, some sort of services to its visitors, to its audience. And to do all this, the museum would require added staff and volunteers, whereas staff, in this case, as has already been pointed out by Rohit in his introduction, in this situation, the staff may not be available because many of the museum staff or heritage people who are working in the heritage sector also have to look after their children and homeschool them. So all these constraints are there in a multi-hazard scenario, risk scenario, which gets realized. Now, stepping back, let's look at it. What the professionals had to face here, what the heritage professionals in Croatia had to face. They knew about the risk of earthquake, and in many organizations, this risk was partially treated but not fully treated, because that is evident from the way the buildings collapsed. Furthermore, they did not know about one of the risks, that was COVID, and because of that, they had to shut down their business or to shut down their heritage sites and museums. And then on top of it, there is, from this situation of COVID and earthquake, new risks have emerged, and that have to be treated as they go on, such as, the theft or fire or other such risks are now more probable. So what are we saying here? As we go on, we are understanding that we are inadequately assessing and treating known risks, while new risks have already been created or are in the process of creation. That means we have to build capacities for prevention, preparedness, response, as well as absorbing shock. Earlier, we used to think that, okay, I am preventing, now I'm in the prevention phase, now I'm in response phase, now I'm in recovery phase. But this idea has been completely shattered by these multi-hazard risk scenarios. And in short, we have to move towards scenario-based planning and enhancing capacities for worst-case scenarios, as well as address systemic vulnerabilities, which were, I think, highlighted in the first week, the previous week webinar, where underlying causes for disasters were explained and explained by the panelists. Moving on to another type of scenario. Imagine that a World Heritage Site with unique cultural and natural elements gets flooded. It has unique flora and fauna and is habitat for several endangered species. It gets flooded due to a super cyclone. And this time, this happened in India in May 2020, when Eastern India was struck by a super cyclone. The entire region was under lockdown due to COVID pandemic. The people who live on the edge of this World Heritage Site are forest dwellers, so they subsist on the forests, and who are poor as well as marginalized. Furthermore, they are threatened by tigers and poisonous snakes. As the site is located at the edge of the sea, it gets excess salty water, which also happened during this pandemic, this super cyclone, and its delicate ecosystem has been threatened. It has been cut off from the mainland. Now I believe the link has been restored, and risk of COVID has increased, and other disease is also high because of the flooding. And animals have broken the nets of the the nature reserve and the World Heritage Site. And at this place, the two communities of different religion live in harmony, as they have a common source of subsistence, that is the forest. However, elsewhere in the country, there are communal tensions because of COVID, and this is giving a political dimension to the response. Now, in this case, what is needed? Again, there is a need for humanitarian response and recovery to be coordinated with that of the natural reserve. And moreover, the forests, which are mangroves and act as a cyclone and tsunami barrier, are threatened by upstream developments. So in order to achieve resilience, these developments have to be addressed, which are causing harm to the natural reserve. However, in a very stereotypical manner, it's the people who are considered to be the threat to the forests. People who live here have traditional knowledge on how to mitigate floods and also how to maintain the ecosystem of the site. But instead of seeing them as strength, a source of resilience, they're seen as enemies. And what is truly needed now is that we enhance their capacities for response and engage them in developing effective disaster risk management, where they're seen as partners, and we transcend this divide between nature and culture to generate systems and see animals, humans, other species, as well as the natural reserve as one unit, not as one versus another. So this is not a choice here. All have to survive together, and we have to look at it, and that challenges the traditional definitions of heritage. Another aspect that we have to take into account because of COVID, this has come out sharply in focus, is the rising inequality. And these inequalities exist within heritage sector also. It's one of the most unorganized sectors. In many countries, it is informal sector where the focus is on experts and those who are engaged in crafts or cultural industries, or even managing are involved in managing sites. Some of the ones who are really at the spot are the first ones, like the guards, or they may not have safety nets, and they may not have adequate insurance or other kinds of support systems, which has created tensions. And so this is a kind of a risk driver that we are seeing, which has come out of COVID, is the rising inequality, and because of that, unemployment and which is leading to civic unrest, and combine that with weather events, extreme weather events. So you're looking at very complex interacting hazards, vulnerabilities, and events that will have to be dealt in a coordinated manner, and no one field or no one agency can respond to them effectively on their own. That means we have to break traditional silos. Now, in just when the lockdowns began, or the restrictions were being put in place, Eeprom, with the help of the ITC and the first aid and resilience networks, developed assessment forms to assess impacts, needs, as well as risks arising out of the current pandemic. And the feedback that we have received from the field is clearly indicating that there is an increased need for coordination and multi-hazard risk management. And that means we have to think about prevention, preparedness, response, and recovery uh, in a continuum, not in silos. And at the same time, we have to consider multiple hazards. The other aspect is that we have to develop robust systems and effective on the ground mechanisms, and that cannot be developed without the active cooperation of people. And we have to exploit the traditional knowledge that exists, the communal networks that exist, and build upon that. That means we have to enhance people's capacity to protect heritage wherever, and at the same time, that means moving away from an expert-centric vision. Heritage services have to consider the needs of the local people, and this also means investing in subaltern discourses for valorizing heritage. That means how people value heritage has to be considered in disaster risk management plans, and not the other way around, how experts value heritage. So that's a very different shift that is being seen in the field. We have all witnessed how the movements such as Black Lives Matter have brought out the issues of decolonizing heritage, or looking at respecting views of those who were whose heritage was taken over, or histories were written from a top down, or or from the point of view of the most powerful. At the same time, we have to, in order to have effective disaster risk management, we have to reduce systemic vulnerabilities. That means creating safety nets for people who are working within heritage sector, and bridging digital divides, because there is a lot of focus on providing digital access, whereas many artisans, craftspeople, those engaged in creative industries do not have access to digital devices, and or access to internet, and that has to be looked into, and systematically these vulnerabilities have to be reduced. We have to also understand how we can develop programs that embrace resilience, and that I have already highlighted through my previous examples. And at the same time, it is time that our network, which has been created through ITC or Eeprom's other networks, such as the first aid and resilience, we call them cultural first aiders, these networks have to come together and join hands in designing capacity building in most risk-prone regions, with the organizations such as Eeprom, Ritsumaken, also Smithsonian Institution, institutions that are engaged in doing this have to also now, in some ways, pass on to the network and let them help us and lead us in developing new directions. And with that, I would like to say thank you. For more information about First Aid and Resilience Program, I have given the link, and I'll be available for questions after this presentation. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Aparna, for stressing, emphasizing how COVID-19 pandemic concerns should be considered through scenario-based planning. And by enhancing capacities to address worst-case scenarios due to biological hazard alongside other multiple hazards. For developing capacity building program on ground that embrace resilience, we need harmonized thinking based on the lessons from traditional knowledge, localized viewpoint, and coordinating multiple hazard risk management. Thank you, Aparna. Now I'm pleased to invite our next panelist, Dr. Wesley Chick, who is a fellow of Japan Society for the Promotion of Science and a visiting researcher at Brigham University. He is a socialist of disasters focusing on community involvement in post-disaster reconstruction and critical urban theory. Over to you, Wes.
Thank you. I think you called me a socialist of disasters, which is fine too. Sociologist of disasters, either way.
Okay.
Either way. All right, everybody, let me switch over to my screen. And there we go. And we'll start. All right, so thank you, everybody. So I'm Wesley Cheek. I am a Japan Society for Promotion of Science Fellow at Ritsumeikan's Disaster Mitigation of Urban Cultural Heritage Institute, which is where I am right now. It's rainy season here in Kyoto, so I hope you're all staying dry where you are. It's very rainy for us here. So the research I'm going to talk about with you tonight or today or morning, whatever it is where you are, has been running in parallel to the ITC course over these last 5 or more years now. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. All right. So here you see the French philosopher, sociologist, Henri Lefebvre, looking very much the French philosopher here in his suit with his cigarette. In his classic text, The Production of Space, which was published in 1974, he posed this question to us: what would remain of the church if there were no churches? Which is an interesting conundrum for us. But we need to realize, like, Henri Lefebvre wasn't particularly worried about the Christian church. That's not what he's asking about here, especially as a French Marxist. I don't think he was that concerned with the church. But he was asking us what would happen to a particular community of people, the church here in this instance, if the buildings, the physical spaces that are both the space in which people gather and the symbol of people's connectedness, a church, cease to exist. So this is an interesting question for those of us who are involved in cultural heritage and disasters, because we face this dilemma not as a philosophical question, but as an actual issue that we're asked to solve, right, on a regular basis. We all deal with this. What happens to the people, the community of people, in whatever way they're formed, if the buildings that kind of hold them together cease to exist? All right. So I made this little nice animation here. So we don't even have to think about the church. We can think about the people and the buildings, right? And these little red lines are the connection to hold them together, right? So we have the people and buildings in these connections. So for us, usually in our work, oftentimes the buildings have ceased to exist. So the community, however scattered and traumatized, wish to retain their connection. So our answer generally is about the elasticity of heritage, whether we term it cultural heritage generally, or intangible heritage, or movable heritage specifically. We understand that there is a connection that exists outside of the main physical structures, right? So, but this connection also exists in relation to these physical structures. So they don't reside just in the physical structures, but the physical structure is part of these connections, these community connections. So our work that we do exists in this nexus between these endlessly breakable, maddeningly breakable physical structures, interacting with inspiringly resilient human beings who utilize heritage both to sustain themselves and to retain or reconstruct their built environment, right? So we kind of look at how do we keep these people together without the buildings, right? but we usually do it through these connections. We talk about doing it through these connections. And what's happened now with the current COVID-19 pandemic is that this kind of equation, this question is being reversed on us. So I'm going to look at that a little bit today. So generally, in my research that I do, and what I usually talk about in the ITC course is my work, my research that I've been doing for the last 8 years now, I guess. I've been trying to understand this, in particular, a small fishing village with a population around 10,000 people called Minami Sanriku in Miyagi Prefecture. Minami Sanriku was drastically affected by the 2011 Great East Japan earthquake and tsunami, which you might also refer to as 311. 60% of the buildings were destroyed. Lots of people were killed. It was a tremendous, tremendous disaster in this area. So usually when I talk about how do we maintain these connections, these elasticity, we can talk about volunteerism and mutual aid. These are members of the Peace Boat organization who were distributing free food in the days following the disaster. This is in Ishinomaki. Also, I talk a lot about local festivals. This is the Kaminoyama Hachimangu Shrine in Minami Sanriku, which Ritsumeikan's done a lot of work with this particular shrine and looking at how local festivals throughout history have kind of kept the community together and how they have kept running even during this post-disaster reconstruction period. So this is a small local festival here that that where it took place was destroyed by the tsunami, and then because of the reconstruction, it couldn't continue as it used to, but still the people of the town got together and made sure that it happened every year. Also, I talk a lot about traditional culture kind of being maintained through folkways and more informal settings. Heritage can also be maintained through these traditional cultures, such as the women in this community center, which is located in temporary housing for people from Minami Sanriku. They're making a type of intricate paper cutouts called kiriko, and these were kind of arts and crafts and different kinds of projects that happen throughout temporary housing in Minami Sanriku to kind of keep people having those bonds and connections in their community, despite the buildings not being present. Also, of course, importantly, mainly what I research are community meetings. And these community meetings are important for lots of reasons. One, they actually decide on what the built environment is going to be for the future, for the town, right? That's important. And they are also ways of establishing and reestablishing and making new connections within the town, of having people come together and decide about their future collectively. And of course, there's always inequalities and problems within these meetings that I talk about in my research a lot. But for today, we're going to look at these, the mainly positive thing, and say that this is where people get together and decide what their built environment is going to be in the future, what the physical environment, the structure of the town is going to be. So generally, collectively, we advocate for working with and for the community to make important decisions regarding the built environment. But we get back to this equation again. However, in the current pandemic, these connections that we advocate for have been ruptured, right? So you can see where I'm leading with these examples. These are usually the go-to advice or evidence I use to demonstrate the elasticity of local heritage, of its ability to continue its own existence outside of the physical damage or loss of buildings and cities. However, now we have inverted this, or worse, disabled, taken away part of it. We have buildings, but we can't bring people together, right? Or in the worst case scenario, we don't have the buildings yet either. So a lot of these towns throughout the Tohoku region of Japan are still in the process of rebuilding, but can no longer have people gather in large groups, right? So for us as researchers, this can be frustrating too. For example, I research community meetings. And in March of this year, I had just begun a new research project. The town of Minami Sanriku would begin holding community meetings to decide what to do with this building, which you might be familiar with. It's the Disaster Management Center in Minami Sanriku. If you're not familiar, the story's out there, is readily available. You can look it up. It's a very dramatic story of what happened here. This kind of building has transformed into a national and even international symbol of the disaster itself and of resilience from the disaster since the tsunami. There's a great deal of controversy in the town about preserving this, and the funding, the prefectural funding for it is about to run out. So the town has established new meetings which they are going to decide what to do with it in the future. But now all of a sudden those meetings can't happen because of COVID-19. So when the money is coming from outside, as it was from the prefecture, the controversy over the building can be quelled for a bit. But when you ask the townspeople to pay up for preserving a building, many of them wish to be bulldozed, everything gets a little more complicated. So I was going to attend the monthly meetings and chronicle what took place. But now like a lot of researchers, I can't travel across prefectural borders and possibly infect a largely elderly rural population. So all kind of our research ethics get entangled in COVID-19 as well. And so not only for the people in the towns, but for us as researchers trying to reflect what's happening, we are dealing with this as well. So all of these new kind of ways to maintain community ties, to maintain the bonds of a population are popping up, right? Lots of them are using the internet. Most of them are using the internet right now. But we start to see inequalities in those too and how they're used. For example, we can formulate these barriers. You have lack of access to the internet, unfamiliarity with technologies, hearing or sight impaired, security or privacy concerns. And it's possible that these new barriers that have arisen might also need to lead to new solutions, right? So for lack of access to internet, we might have expansion of public internet. We might have education and outreach to educate about new technologies. We might have more inclusive technologies for people who are differently abled. We might have new methods and protections for security privacy concerns, but these are all, we don't know yet. We don't know what's going to happen in terms of maintaining the kind of bonds of an area now that we cannot congregate. So sometimes the best thing a researcher can say is, I don't know. That's hard for us to say, but sometimes we need to say it. And I think we're in that period right now. A lot of us are trying to scramble and come up with answers about how to handle this crisis, but in reality, there's so much we don't know. It's been 9 years since 3/11, and I'm still trying to figure out answers to that disaster. That does not mean, however, that we can just throw our hands up. We should be thinking about these things in the present and using our past research and experience to navigate the present crisis, which is not just a pandemic, but the economic, political, societal, racial, gender, geographic inequalities that we have yet to really solve in any meaningful way. So we can look at this as capacity building. We often do, and that term gets thrown around a lot. But as researchers, the main capacity that we should concentrate on building is understanding how all of these things we try to understand fit into the larger world, and how what affects the local issues that we study are products of larger, often globalized structures. All right. So what lies beyond online solutions? I don't find myself particularly inspired by living out the echoes of community over the internet. I'm sure many of you are also already becoming a bit tired of online meetings, webinars, teleconferences, and the like, except for this one, of course. This one is excellent, and you're all super excited about it. But outside of this one, of course, as a stopgap measure, what else do we have? So maybe this pause in the everyday continuation of our present society will provide the opportunity to ask larger questions. It is certain that a 10-meter seawall is not currently protecting the Japanese coastline from a pandemic, right? So nor is it from a myriad of other hazards that are not a tsunami. I'm sure this is true in your work as well, wherever that work is concerned, right? There's no giant infrastructure project outside of public health as an infrastructure project that is keeping us safe from this pandemic. Interestingly, how we are keeping ourselves safe is through our mutual obligations to each other. So maybe this abnormal year will help us to ask difficult questions about what it is that holds all of us together. We collectively certainly seem to want to be together despite dire warnings to stay apart. So maybe there's something in that people feel a collective need to be together or to at least be around each other in some way or another. As heritage specialists and disaster researchers, we already understand that fact, I think, and I think that's one strength that we have in this. We see people under incredible odds against them willing themselves towards mutual aid and cooperation. So I will end on that note. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vance. What an interesting example that provides us a sociological lens for disaster risk management in post-COVID times. So Vance in his presentation has illustrated the link between community and built environment that results in resilient human beings who utilize heritage for their sustenance. We should be thinking about integrated perspectives and using our past research and experiences to navigate the present crisis, which is not just a pandemic, but also bringing forward the economic, political, societal, racial, gender, geographic inequalities that we have yet to really solve. Okay, before we moving to our next panelist, I would like all the audience to post your questions on Q&A icon. So if you have any questions to panelists, please add your questions on Q&A icon in here. Okay, so we are awaiting your very interesting questions for our panelist discussion. Okay, so now I have a pleasure of requesting Miss Elke Selter, who is a doctoral researcher at SOAS, University of London. Her current research focuses on international politics, heritage, and armed conflict, and looks mainly at recent developments and interest in heritage within international organizations. She has worked with the United Nations, including with UNESCO, in crisis and conflict situations in Bosnia, Cambodia, Haiti, Mali, Nepal, and South Sudan. She will be present the post-emergency assessment in the aid sector, including rapid damage and impact assessments for heritage. Over to you, Elke.
Thank you, Johan. Let me try and share my screen. So I was asked to talk to you about the post-disaster needs assessment in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. And for those of you who've been in the ITC courses in the last few years, you've heard me talk at much greater length about this assessment and what it means. Today I'll try to, talk about it in a much briefer form. The PDNA stands short for Post-Disaster Needs Assessment. It's a methodology that collects and analyzes data after an emergency, and it does so across sectors. So this is not a tool for culture only. This is something that has been developed by the United Nations, the World Bank, and the European Union, and that looks at things like infrastructure, the economy. It will look at the health sector, it looks at education, and one of all these components is culture. Usually, and I think understandably in a way, not the most significant component of these big assessments. You see a picture at the bottom of my screen, and it may be hidden a little bit behind our videos, but that's how the cover of the assessment looks. There's a link underneath where you can download it. This is the methodology, right? It's downloadable for free. If you can't copy the link, you can just put in any search engine, PDNA culture, and on the GFDRR site, you'll find a link to that. So here is my next slide. The slide shows you the scope of what a PDNA really is. On the top part, so the orange fields are the process, which is not what I'm going to be talking about today, but I'll talk about what's in gray. And the gray is the content, as it were. So the light gray shows you that it covers a very broad or comprehensive it covers in a very comprehensive way the culture sector. So it doesn't just look at built heritage or objects and big institutions like museums, but it will also include intangible heritage. It includes culture and creative industries, and so on and so forth. It can cover a natural heritage. It can cover mixes of natural and cultural heritage. It all fits neatly in there. And then the dark gray shows you that for each of these aspects of the sector, it also looks at a variety of dimensions. It doesn't just look at the culture assets per se. It doesn't just look at the building or the object, but it looks at access, at participation, at risks and vulnerabilities, and at things like governance and policy. And in each time, of course, we're dealing with an assessment of an impact of a disaster, right? And that brings me to, I think, is the first of, and I mentioned two reasons why I think this is very interesting for the current situation. The first is exactly that comprehensive approach, because when we do assessments, we very often look at monuments or built heritage. We'll look at institutions and we'll look at the objects within these institutions. But there's many other aspects which tend to be forgotten in culture sector assessments of the impact of a disaster. And things like access and participation, for example, are very important in the current situation. It's always important, but I think even more so now, because we don't have the same physical damage. And as Wes basically showed, so your places of worship will be standing. There's nothing to assess there in terms of damage, but people can't go there anymore, or services don't take place. And actually, this is a methodology that looks at that. The same for the governance of the sector. So Governance looks at, for example, civil servants. It looks at public budgets for the culture sector. And what we see now is mainly two types of approaches. There's countries where, because the government has to invest significantly more in other sectors, like the health sector, for example, or other aspects of the economy, they'll withdraw money from sectors which they consider less important at the moment, and culture is very easily a victim of that. But, and that's I think very promising, we've also seen in many countries, whether at a national or at a local level, that public budgets are, these recovery funds are being created, and parts of these funds are actually allocated to the culture sector. So that will come in the form of, for example, subsidies for artisans and artists. And I think it's quite logic that if you want to make an assessment of the impact of the pandemic on the culture sector, whether it's in your country, your region, your city, that understanding that shift in public budgets is quite essential. There's no way to understand how a recovery of a sector is going to happen unless you know whether there's more or less public funding available. And the same actually applies to donor funding. That brings me to a second reason why I think the PDNA is a very useful method at the moment, and that is the economic focus of the PDNA. So the methodology has very often been criticized for being too much of, and they call it a World Bank tool, and I'm not saying this as a point of criticism. I think for the culture sector, that's actually what makes it a very useful tool. When the PDNA methodology was created, it actually was based on an earlier tool by the World Bank to assess the economic impact of disasters. And it was merged together with one from the United Nations that looked more at the social impact. Now, in reality, this merger still has a very strong economic focus. And I think in the case of the COVID-19 pandemic, that actually is very valuable, because as a sector, we have a lot of tools already, right? All of you, whether you deal with built heritage or with collections, you have, there's many checklists. There's loads of organizations who make checklists, manuals. We now have them in mobile phone applications. They may be linked to GIS trackers. All of that is out there. But to move from a tool that allows you to measure every single crack in a building to a tool that allows you to actually put a budget to that, and that looks at what the big economic impact is, not just of fixing those cracks, but of making this institution or this site operational again, what it means in terms of staff, what you need in terms of temporary measures. That is what the PDNA can do for you. And I mentioned this before, but COVID-19 didn't make buildings crumble like an earthquake. It didn't have the same type of damage as a fire in a museum. So you have extremely little to no physical impact of the current emergency, which doesn't mean that it hasn't impacted the sector, right? So we have a tool here that in its own way allows you actually quite well to make a big picture overview of this economic and to a lesser extent social impact. So it will allow you, for example, to look at what happened with the staffing of the sector, how many people were made redundant. It will look at loss in revenue when tourism comes to a halt, so during the lockdown, but it also allows you to track that over a longer period of time, so that, for example, if tourism will remain slow for the next 12 months or 18 months or even more, that you can measure quite nicely how big of an impact that's going to have on the recovery of your site or your institution or the sector as a whole. And I'll move to the last slide because I probably am reaching the end of my time. The top part of the slide are things which I already mentioned. So I'll focus a little bit on this last sentence because I think the COVID-19 pandemic, like any crisis, basically can also offer an opportunity. It can be a way for us to learn and to see if we can do things better in the future. So on the previous slide, I showed you, and I tried to promote a bit, that the PDNA is a very good tool because it is so comprehensive. And reality is, of course, that that's on paper. In theory, I think it can be a very good tool. In practice, and I have been involved in a number of these PDNAs in the past, in practice, that's not really what is done. We do focus very much on tangible heritage, whether built or movable. And I think there's two reasons for that. There's two reasons why things like intangible heritage or culture and creative industries, or even the social impact that Wes has also been talking about, is much less covered. And the first reason is when I mentioned that we have all these tools for assessing built heritage and movable heritage, we don't have a very good equivalent for things like intangible heritage. So we don't have these technical assessment tools that then can feed into the PDNA. And the second, which is not an excuse, but very much a personal observation from being in disaster situations, is that when physical damage is very big, so when you're in an earthquake and everything literally crumbled down, that's what you first look at and that's what you first try to deal with. Things like intangible heritage, it requires, you know, to look beyond the rubble which is in front of you, and I think quite often we just simply don't have the time for that. Combined then with there not being ample tools for it, has unfortunately resulted in us having much less experience in addressing these sectors in an equal way. So I think COVID-19 offers an opportunity in that sense, because we now have a global crisis which for the culture sector has little or no physical impact, but does have an important economic and social impact. And whether it's then for tangible heritage or for intangible, it's been affected in relatively equal manners. And I think it's a very good opportunity to see in what way we can use this methodology that is out there to do a comprehensive assessment of how the crisis situation is affecting heritage in a different way than what we normally look at. So I'll finish on that note. I hope that I was able to inspire at least a few of you, and I'm always happy to provide you with more information if anyone would be interested in doing this type of assessments for your own place. Thank you.
Thank you, Elke. The PDNA is a method for assessing damage and needs after an emergency, and it is useful in the context of COVID-19. Especially from economic perspective, PDNA is very strong and could provide for a very relevant assessment tool. But PDNA has traditionally been much weaker in assessing social impact, as well as impact on non-material heritage. Therefore, COVID-19 emergency may be an excellent opportunity to improve on this aspect of the method. Thank you, Elke. And now I would like to invite Ming Jiang, who is the General Manager at Georgetown World Heritage Incorporated. She is an alumnus of the ITC in 2017 and will present the case study of Georgetown UNESCO World Heritage Site. She's a real practitioner who continues to mobilize the local communities to develop a localized disaster risk management plan to create a safer, better, and more sustainable historical city for the people who live in, work in, and visit to Georgetown. Over to you, Ang.
Yep. Hi, everyone. I'm Ang. I'm from Georgetown, Penang, Malaysia. So I will be sharing with you as a ITC 2017 graduate and alumni, how do I use the theory and the knowledge I learned from ITC into the site management of in Georgetown, Penang, Malaysia, by building, preparing my team, as well as mitigating the impact of COVID-19 at my site. So over here on my first slide, you're going to see on the left the pictures of the World site, one of the very popular temple in the site. Before COVID-19 is full with people, and I believe a lot of us face the same lockdown situations. And in Malaysia, we have the government imposed the movement control order from the 18th of March. And the right picture is what you see when the lockdown was happening. Here, it's good that Rohit has introduced the disaster risk management cycle. So my presentation basically will be telling you of like, what do we do, as a site managers before, during, and after with COVID-19 as our case. The training in ITC is really very helpful because when I learned the knowledge, I went back to my site, and we have been preparing for fire and flood in our site. So we have identified our historical attributes, our values, our heritage, and we also have mobilized and have the culture of preparing SOP to deal with disaster. So when COVID-19 came up in as early as December 2019 in China, the team in my site, we started to think about, what can we adjust from the fire prevention SOP into a COVID-19 SOP. So as you can see over here, is a print screen of our response plan. We have actually very systematically list down what are the things that we have to focus on. For example, what is the objective of the plan, the situation for our company, the situation of the COVID-19 to our site, how do we handle the visitors, how do we handle the activities in our site, how do we handle crisis management. I think it's very important to prepare the paperwork before you deal with, we know that COVID-19 is coming, but we have to prepare ourselves and our team before the real risk comes. We also has been preparing because of the flood and fire disaster risk management, been digitizing all our documents. So it enables us to work from my team. We are able to mobilize, working from home. I think a lot of us are facing a resource scarcity problem, but there are a lot of things that we can do without costing too much. For example, get actively engaged, get the phone number of your colleagues and your communities, and we must keep everyone in the loop. After 18th of March 2020, a lot of people are not allowed to move out from their home, but I have the opportunity as a site manager to view the site from time to time. One of the photos you can see over here, this is one of the oldest restaurants in the town, and these are the back food. You can see things are happening on site, by the individual operators, cultural heritage practitioners. They are trying to adapt. So at the same time, we try to hop on into the mechanism by the local government, by the state government of how to fight COVID-19. Hop up to the opportunities and resources available and address a problem that is needed by our local community in the site. It's very, very important. So we do, from time to time, rescue and salvations, addressing the needs of the most vulnerable people by texting them, WhatsApping them, calling each other. That is very basic, but very, very useful for Georgetown. As you can see, this is during the notice outside the door. A lot of shops are closed down, and when we were informed that the cases in Malaysia is low enough and somehow safe for us to come back to work, and that was in May recently. So in order to go back, we have to prepare our site, to go back. So we have prepared a 3-language SOP of how do you take visitors. And then we share this with everyone in the site so that they can follow the best practices. As you can see, not only in theory that you have to come up with the solutions, we enforce it 100% in our site. Everyone have to wear masks, and we have to provide masks to all our staff so that they feel safe to conduct their daily activities as a site manager with the local communities. We also work together with the state government, who have created the Penang care system. That means you can trace a visitor in your office or into your sites, into your museum, into your gallery, when slowly we open up. So again, you know, in Georgetown, Malaysia, we use 3 languages, English, Malay, and Chinese. And we listed this out for free. And so it helps a lot of people to quickly adopt into new normal. And as you can see, some of the creation by the local community. So it's important to do a very careful site inspections. And that's what we do. Observe the good practices and distribute, share with more people. This is my last slide. We are now, you know, dealing with the after COVID-19, because by today we only have 10 new cases and less than 1,000 active cases. So it is very important for Malaysia that we are ready to open up fully. So what can we do now in helping the tangible and intangible heritage? As you can see, we are having a lot of works, meetings, but virtually online. And in next Monday, we are going to launch a new project called Georgetown in the New Normal. We are going to find the remaining resources that we can find from the state government. For example, we're going to help the support local business by helping them establish themselves in the digital platforms, so that more people will know that they have good products. And these the photos is one of the examples that, you know, this batik mask, handmade 100%. Everyone is suffering, so we are helping them to promote their products. We are also going to launch heritage repair and heritage video projects. So if you are keen to know what Georgetown World Heritage Incorporated is doing, please follow on our social media, on our Facebook, or you can email me and I'll try to share our experience with you as much as possible. I wish everyone safe and a lot of strength in continue fighting COVID-19 in your respective site. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ang. This is a really practical example that you made on your presentation. You nicely shared the application of the disaster risk management cycle in Georgetown by adapting it to the needs of COVID-19 pandemic situation. Your practices on Georgetown emphasized the importance of immediate implementation and the innovative trials to reduce the multiple risks and damages through various preparedness, mitigation, and recovery strategies. Thank you, Ang. Okay, so now may I request Rohit to moderate the discussion by posting questions received from the audiences for our panelists.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Devon. So we have received many interesting questions for our panelists and also very important comments. We have very limited time, so I'll ask one question to each panelist. So first question is for Aparna. So Aparna, the question for you is like, how do you think we can work with humanitarian organizations and other related agencies differently in considering the COVID-19 pandemic for response and recovery? So what is the different approach in which we can work with the humanitarian sector?
Well, thank you, Rohit. In this situation, I think first important aspect is to know the organizations that are supporting livelihoods. For example, Elke said that there are not many assessment tools that are looking at the needs of the intangible heritage. But in parallel, there are NGOs, humanitarian organizations that may be known to you locally. It's either Save the Children or let's say Red Cross, or they are carrying out such evaluations where they're looking at more crafts and creative industries, not per se for intangible heritage, but some of the proxy data can be picked up from them. And the idea is this should have happened before. We should have made contacts with organizations like this before, but now it's never too late. So get in touch with who is working in your neighborhood to provide this kind of humanitarian assistance, There are people who are even providing free meals, or like the example given by Ang about products that are being done. So there are such programs being run everywhere. My suggestion would be to connect with these programs, pick up the data that they are already collecting, and use it as an indicative data, not as a very fixed data, but as an indicative data of what are the impacts on the sector, and it will give a very clear picture. Especially it will also help with built heritage. For example, many of the conservation programs have been stopped, and the laborers or the temporary workers or craftspeople who were involved with this kind of work are not finding work anymore. But the humanitarians, on the other hand, are providing meals or other kind of things. So we can actually gather information and make arrangements. From the other point of view, very quickly, is that we can carry out now post-event risk assessments with the disaster relief agencies and national disaster risk platforms, but at a local level. And the whole, I think, focus should be on identifying local actors and working with them. Thank you. I hope
Thank
I
you very
answered.
much. Thank you. Thank you. So the next question, Wes, is for you. So if you can turn on your camera, Wes. This is really, so the question is like, one of the challenges in recovery is relocation. So people are uprooted from where they belong, and so they always want to be located at the same place where they are born and brought up. So the question, how does one really implement a spatial plan in case of a recovery following a disaster, which can take care of both the protection of the community but also cultural heritage, because they might not be in going together well. So how does one achieve this kind of a objective?
I'm going to give you a very unsatisfying answer, which is there's no perfect solution to that. There's no great solution to it. And that actually, even to start out the question, not everyone even wants to go back, right? We suppose that they do, and a lot of people do, but some people, especially in my research, get fed up and say, I'm done with it. I don't want to be here anymore. And one thing I would caution us as researchers is we often don't talk to the people who give up and say they're not interested and disappear, right, and leave. But even for people who do want to be there, it's still a really difficult process. And I think you have to accept that there's never going to be a perfect solution. You're never going to make everybody happy. You're never going to get resolution, especially with the trauma of a disaster. You're never going to have where it feels exactly right, right? But what you got to do is have a good faith approach to the process and think about it as a long process where people are going to disagree. No one's going to be perfectly happy. But as long as you're trying to work in good faith on the process and to acknowledge the inequalities that exist, you can make progress through it. But there's never going to be a perfect solution, I think.
Thank you, Wes. Thank you for your response. Next, I'll be requesting our next panelist, LK. LK, this question is about pDNA. How do you think, the question is whether it is possible to implement pDNA remotely, at least to some degree, considering the current situation?
Yeah, I saw the questions also from Okubo-san. So what I was trying to explain also is not that we don't do assessments beyond material heritage, right? It's just that when we do it far less well. And I think that's also what Aparna was referring to. And we need to get better. And this, I think, is an opportunity because the material focus is not there right now. So we have a crisis which allows us to put up front this non-material and social impact of a crisis on the culture sector. And can you do it remotely? I think you can, in some degree. I don't think you can do it perfectly because there is an aspect where it is really important to be able to work with people. And I think Wes has also shown what kind of challenges this poses at the moment. But there are loads of data out there that you can collect remotely. It also depends on how well you know the context, but if you are from there, and I think when David is talking about Mexico, for example, that it is perfectly possible to just over Skype get in touch with people and conduct interviews online and have focus groups online and so on. I just wanted to add a little point on what Okubo-san asked, because he asked whether there's concrete tools that we can use for this among the existing ones, and I think that's exactly the problem, that we have a lot of tools out there, but they're all so much focused on physical damage. And they look at many dimensions of it, and they go through many different formats, whether online or not. But I think this non-physical aspect of it is something that we have a hard time for the culture sector to include in these tools that we have. And there may be elements in what humanitarian agencies do. But again, it would be kind of trying to pick little elements out of big assessments, which in an emergency or after an emergency is never very helpful, because nobody has time to go and look through all of that. So back to what I started with, I think this is kind of a little plea to see if we can use this as an opportunity to actually prepare for that, and to maybe make something that allows us to do this better in the future, because I guess this is not going to be our last crisis to deal with.
Thank you, LK. I will now ask the question to Dr. Ang Ming Chi. So, Dr. Ang, the question is, actually there are two questions here. One is, as a site manager, what is your message to the other site managers? Any key message you would like to convey? Because they might be frustrated. I think one of the things that we have come is that many of them are facing very, there are not enough resources available because they are dedicated to other things, and for heritage and for conservation probably there are less resources available. So what is your message for them? How do we address this challenging situation?
Yeah, thank you, Rohit. I think I only have one very simple message. You know, site managers are committed to care for the site 365 days a year and 24 hours a day. And when our site are hit with COVID-19, we have to work with our team for our site. So the resources, while financial resources may be very challenging now, but we have local resources, for example, the local knowledge, the local people, the local business, the local economic ecology. So let's find the opportunity that we already have, you know, the time, resources, and actually this is a good time to rebuild the site in a more sustainable way, you know, with tourism now coming to almost a restart mode, you know. Can we work out a better plan for our site? You know, what do we actually care most for our site? This is number one. Number two is like listen to the people, because the people, what I mean the people is the local community, will tell you the actual situations, what they need most. While we know that digital platform will be the new normal. You know, everyone is trying to talk about webinars, you know, digital promotion on the social platforms. But I have identified that, you know, maybe about 60% of the local community and the businesses in Georgetown have not started that. You know, so why is it happening that way? You know, what can we do as a site managers? All these opportunities will help us to identify ourselves as essential site managers in any world site. So that is my message. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ang, for your response. We have also a few more questions, but because of shortage of time, I think maybe we will have a little time at the end of the webinar for more questions to come in, and we'll be responding to them later. So I'll pass the floor to Dovon now. Over to you, Dovon. Thank you.
Thank you, Rohit. This is wonderful discussion, although the time is really short. So I'd like to once again express gratitude to all the panelists and our organizing team here at RD Much and Eeprom that has been working hard to bring these webinars to you under this extraordinary circumstance. So, and we also thank all the attendees for participating in the webinar and raising important and really interesting questions. The recorded version of this webinar and proceedings will be available on RDMuch and Eeprom website soon. Lastly, I really like to take this opportunity to request the audiences to post your comments and queries after closing this webinar. I will open this webinar for some time, for some while, due to listen your voices of expectations and for the queries. So we will answer all the questions with our our uploads of the video and proceedings on our website. So thank you so much for being with us. We will be back with new online workshops. So goodbye. Thank you.